A body writhing in rotting organs like a condemned criminal is actually a proud prince worshipped on the golden silks of France. These are the horrific final days of the Duke of Berry, the prince destroyed by a ruptured stomach. Why did a man at the pinnacle of power suffer a humiliating death and become the victim of brutal medical torture from his own royal physicians? Charles de Bourbon, the Duke of Berry, was 27 years old and the embodiment of youth and vigor at the court of Versailles in 1714. As the grandson of King Louis XIV, he possessed a robust physique, an unshakable position in the hierarchy of Europe, and a future that seemed entirely bathed in light. He was the robust survivor in a royal line that had recently been devastated by disease, a beacon of stability for the aging Sun King. Yet, all the worldly glory, the titles, and the absolute power of the Bourbon dynasty meant absolutely nothing when faced with the fragile, unforgiving reality of human biology. The disaster struck during a perfectly ordinary late April hunting trip. Charles was an avid huntsman, accustomed to the rough physical demands of the sport. While riding, his horse stumbled violently. In the sudden, frantic effort to pull the heavy animal back to its feet, the Duke was thrown forward, his chest and abdomen smashing with immense force into the hard, unforgiving pommel of his saddle. Today, any medical professional would immediately recognize this as a severe, blunt abdominal trauma. The sheer kinetic energy of the impact shattered his ribs, driving bone fragments inward to puncture his stomach and lacerate his liver. In that very fraction of a second, the prince's fate was sealed, though he did not yet know it. Highly corrosive hydrochloric acid from his ruptured stomach began to leak directly into his abdominal cavity. This devastating internal spill instantly triggered chemical peritonitis. The strongest prince in the realm was suddenly, utterly powerless, at the mercy of his own digestive acids, which were now actively dissolving his vital organs from the inside out. By the afternoon of Monday, the 30th of April, the situation escalated from a hidden internal injury into a visible, horrifying medical crisis. Charles began coughing up and violently vomiting blood. His powerful frame was reduced to violent shivering fits, racked by bone-chilling cold and a ferociously high fever. It was at this moment that the absolute authority of the French crown collided fatally with the profound ignorance of 18th century medicine. King Louis XIV himself entered the bedchamber, a towering figure of absolute monarchical power, bringing with him the most elite medical minds of the age, his chief physician Guy Crescent Fagan, and the royal apothecary Bolduc. These men were the undisputed authorities of their time, yet their entire medical philosophy was trapped in the ancient, unyielding grip of Galen's theory of the four humors. They genuinely believed, with terrifying certainty, that all human illness stemmed from an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To them, Charles's violent symptoms stemmed entirely from an accumulation of bad blood and toxic vapors that desperately needed to be expelled. Standing under the watchful, expectant gaze of the king, the royal physicians initiated their fatal protocol. They ordered a saignée, a bloodletting. A cold, unsterilized blade was pressed into the vein of the Duke's foot. As the dark, thick blood flowed into a brass bowl, Fagan inspected it and confidently declared it to be corrupted and foul. Bolduc, however, leaned in and whispered to the courtiers that the Duke would not survive this ordeal. They speculated wildly about poison or a bad cup of hot chocolate the Duke had consumed the previous day, completely blind to the reality of the massive internal hemorrhage taking place beneath his skin. This first cut of the lancet was the opening blow of an excruciating torture. Charles was already bleeding heavily into his own abdominal cavity. His circulatory system was desperately trying to maintain blood pressure, sending him into hypovolemic shock. His skin grew remarkably pale. His heart hammered erratically in a desperate bid to push whatever oxygenated blood was left to his starving brain. Instead of stopping the internal bleeding, the physicians deliberately drained even more fluid from his failing system, compounding his shock and accelerating a multi-organ failure. The dawn of Tuesday, the 1st of May, brought no relief, only a drastic escalation of the medical assault. The previous night had been a waking nightmare of pain and confusion for the prince, but at 7 o'clock in the morning the physicians returned. They examined his pale, sweating form and concluded that the corrupted humors were deeply entrenched. They ordered a second bloodletting from his foot. As if draining the life from a man already bleeding to death was not enough, they then turned to their pharmacological arsenal. They forced 2 massive consecutive doses of an emetic down his throat. This was a violently powerful drug designed specifically to induce severe vomiting. To ensure the body was entirely purged, they combined this with a mana purge, a harsh, brutal laxative derived from tree sap, and then administered robal water 3 separate times throughout the day to ostensibly calm the stomach spasms they had just intentionally provoked. The mechanical reality of what these drugs did to Charles's battered body is almost too gruesome to contemplate. The emetics forced his lacerated, acid-soaked stomach to undergo violent, convulsive contractions. Each heave of his chest literally tore the puncture wound wider, ripping the delicate tissue apart. Simultaneously, the violent laxatives caused his intestines to spasm uncontrollably. These immense internal pressures acted like a pump, forcing a catastrophic mixture of highly acidic gastric juices, corrosive bile, pooling blood, and raw fecal matter to flood entirely throughout his abdominal cavity. A severe, rampant bacterial peritonitis took hold instantly. Throughout the entirety of that Tuesday, Charles vomited continuously. The historical accounts describe him expelling vast quantities of blood that had congealed in his stomach, turning into a thick black mud-like substance. He was rapidly losing liters of essential fluids. His lips turned a deep, bruised blue, his limbs trembled uncontrollably, and he was utterly drained of anything resembling vitality. When Louis XIV returned to the bedchamber after attending morning mass, the heavy silence of the royal physicians spoke volumes. There were no comforting words, no reassurances of a royal recovery. The situation was so profoundly grim and physically chaotic that the administration of Holy Communion had to be postponed. The Duke's mouth was constantly overflowing with the dark, putrid blood of his own internal destruction. By Wednesday, the 2nd of May, the royal medical team had abandoned all reason, driven by a desperate, dogmatic need to see their humoral theories work. They looked upon a patient who was effectively a living corpse, entirely drained of color, shaking with a lethal fever, and their solution was to cut him again. They reopened the very same wound on his foot to squeeze out whatever drops of blood they could find, and then, finding that insufficient, they sliced into the veins of his arms. The relentless vomiting of black blood continued unabated. Whispers began to echo through the gilded halls of Versailles, a terrifying rumor that a vein had ruptured inside his stomach. This rumor, ironically, was the closest anyone came to the mechanical truth, though they failed to realize that the violent contractions induced by their own emetics had caused the fatal rupture. Charles's wife, the Duchess of Berry, arrived at the chamber doors, weeping and begging to see her husband, but the king strictly forbade her entry, citing that the patient had not explicitly asked for her. Amidst this agonizing isolation, Charles maintained a heartbreaking sliver of clarity. He turned to his confessor, a man sitting beside a bed that smelled heavily of copper and decay, and whispered his profound regret. He lamented that he was dying from a clumsy fall during a hunt, rather than falling with honor on a battlefield. It was a crushing realization of his own fragility. Stripped of his royal dignity, he became a skeletal figure rapidly consumed by his own failing organs. Every incision of the surgeon's blade pushed him closer to the abyss. Every violent wrench tore his organs further apart. The peritonitis had now reached an advanced necrotic stage. His stomach, his liver, and his intestines were literally dying inside him, turning gangrenous as they dissolved in a toxic soup of acid and infection. Thursday, the 3rd of May, marked the final descent into ultimate physical humiliation and systemic collapse. The morning brought an eerie cessation of the vomiting, but this was not a triumph of medicine. It was the chilling silence of organs that had simply stopped functioning. By the afternoon, a terrifying new symptom emerged. Charles began to choke. The fluid building up in his failing lungs and the immense pressure in his swollen abdomen made it utterly impossible for him to lie flat on the bed. He gasped frantically for air, his chest heaving in a desperate, losing battle against suffocation. At 8 o'clock that evening, in a moment of sheer desperate humanity, he looked at Madame and confessed his fading hope that he might not die. But the agonizing, twisting pain in his bowels returned with a vengeance. His confessor, rigidly adhering to spiritual duty while ignoring the physical horror, sternly commanded the prince to abandon all earthly thoughts and focus solely on God. As the night deepened, Charles's mind finally began to fracture. The relentless lack of oxygen to his brain, combined with overwhelming sepsis, dragged him into a state of profound delirium. The man who was once the sharp, vital future of France was now muttering incoherently, his royal intellect crushed by bacterial toxins. At 10 o'clock, the heavy doors of the chamber opened and Louis XIV entered, bearing the viaticum. In a scene of immense tragic solemnity, the dying prince received the Holy Eucharist and the sacrament of extreme unction under the sorrowful gaze of his king. Charles, drawing upon a deep well of ingrained piety, received the rites with immense devotion, a fleeting moment of spiritual grace amidst a landscape of utter bodily ruin. In the dark, quiet hours of Friday, the 4th of May, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Charles de Bourbon finally stopped breathing. He was 27 years old. In his final moments, stripped of speech and rational thought, his trembling hands managed to grasp a crucifix, pressing it desperately against his failing heart before he slipped away. When the inevitable autopsy was performed, the observers were confronted with a sight of unimaginable devastation. They documented that his stomach had completely lost its structural integrity, reduced to a mashed, necrotic pulp. It was a horrifying testament to the sheer destructive power of human digestive acids unleashed into the abdominal cavity, compounded by rampant bacterial infection and the violent mechanical stress of the forced vomiting. Modern medical analysis provides a crystal clear, devastating verdict on this historical tragedy. The initial blunt abdominal trauma caused a rupture that required immediate, invasive surgical repair and powerful antibiotics, concepts completely alien to the 18th century. Left untreated, it was highly dangerous, but the application of the archaic medical protocol guaranteed a torturous demise. The repeated bloodletting induced profound hypovolemic shock, shutting down his organs one by one. The emetics and harsh purgatives drastically increased his internal pressure. This likely tore the initial wound wide open. Septic peritonitis spread rapidly. Ultimately, it led to the total necrosis of his digestive tract. The horrifying final symptom, the fecal vomiting, the expulsion of blackened blood mixed with decaying intestinal matter, was the ultimate degrading proof of this systemic destruction. Charles de Bourbon was not killed by a stumbling horse. He was systematically dismantled, his organs shattered and his life drained away by a royal medical protocol that stands as a chilling monument to the lethal ignorance of the past. The opulent chamber at Versailles rapidly deteriorated into a claustrophobic scene of biological decay. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic stench of pooling blood and the undeniable sweet-sour odor of necrotic tissue. Servants burned vast quantities of frankincense and myrrh in heavy silver censers, frantically attempting to mask the scent of a human body rotting from the inside out. But the perfumes only created a nauseating mixture, a grotesque olfactory contradiction that perfectly mirrored the tragedy unfolding on the bed. Here lay the future of France, draped in the finest lion's silk, yet sweating profusely, his skin taking on the waxy, translucent pallor of a cadaver while he still drew breath. The courtiers, bound by the rigid etiquette of the Sun King's court, stood for hours in the stifling heat, their faces powdered and expressionless, masking the visceral horror they felt as they watched the young Duke writhe. They were witnessing the systematic destruction of a royal heir, not by an assassin's blade, but by an invisible internal executioner sanctioned by the state. At the absolute center of this macabre theater stood Guy Crescent Fagon, the king's chief physician. The brutality inflicted upon Charles de Bourbon was deeply rooted in the unyielding, almost religious fanaticism of early 18th century medical academia. Fagon was far more dangerous than a simply malicious man. He was absolutely certain of his own righteousness. Educated at the fiercely conservative medical faculty of Paris, his entire worldview was anchored in the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates. In this paradigm, the human body was essentially a vessel of four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. They viewed illness exclusively as a systemic rebellion of these humors, completely blind to localized physical trauma or invading pathogens. When Fagan looked at the agonizing spasms of the Duke of Berry, he did not see a ruptured organ spilling corrosive acid. He saw a catastrophic boiling over of corrupted blood. To question this doctrine was tantamount to heresy. Therefore, Fagan's response to Charles's internal bleeding was not a failure of logic within his own system. It was the ultimate aggressive application of it. If the blood was bad, it had to be evacuated, regardless of the patient's rapidly collapsing pulse. The reality of the repeated bloodlettings, the relentless slicing into the veins of Charles's feet and arms, precipitated a catastrophic physiological cascade. When the cold steel of the lancet opened his veins for the second and third time, his body was already in a state of desperate crisis management. The initial internal hemorrhage from the ruptured liver and stomach had severely depleted his blood volume. In response, his sympathetic nervous system had triggered massive vasoconstriction, narrowing the blood vessels in his extremities to shunt whatever oxygenated blood remained to his brain, heart, and lungs. This is why his skin was icy to the touch and unnervingly pale. By forcing more blood from these constricted veins, the royal physicians actively overrode the body's last-ditch survival mechanisms. The heart, starved of fluid to pump, began to beat with a rapid, fluttering rhythm, a condition known today as tachycardia. As the sheer volume of blood plummeted, the delivery of oxygen to vital tissues ceased. Ischemia set in. Cells deprived of oxygen switched to anaerobic metabolism, flooding his already toxic bloodstream with lactic acid. The physicians were not bleeding out the sickness. They were systematically draining his cellular life force, plunging him deeper into profound hypovolemic shock. There is a bitter, profound irony in the medical treatment of European royalty during this era. The Duke of Berry suffered exponentially more precisely because he was a prince. Had he been a common soldier or a peasant who suffered a similar fall, he might have been left to rest, given water, and perhaps through sheer biological resilience and the sealing of the wound by natural clotting, he might have survived. But the royal body was a political entity as much as a physical one. It demanded action. The king's presence in the bedchamber necessitated a performance of medical mastery. Fagin and his colleagues could not simply watch and wait. Inaction would be perceived as impotence or worse, treasonous neglect. Therefore, they deployed their most aggressive, violent interventions. The brutal purgatives, the heavy emetics, the relentless bleeding. These were the medical equivalents of an artillery barrage, meant to demonstrate power and control over the disease. The courtiers watched in silent paralysis, completely aware of the Duke's agony, but utterly unable to intervene. To stop the doctors would be to challenge the king who had appointed them, an act of social and political suicide. And so the machinery of court etiquette and medical dogma ground the young man down. The physical torture was immense, but the psychological suffering of Charles de Bourbon adds a layer of profound tragedy to his final days. Despite the severe trauma and the creeping sepsis clouding his mind, he experienced agonizing periods of terrifying lucidity. He was a young man in the absolute prime of his life, a hunter, a soldier, fully aware of his own strength. Now he was trapped inside a failing vessel, forced to passively accept the excruciating treatments that he instinctively knew were killing him. When he vomited the blackened, necrotic blood, he saw the physical manifestation of his own rotting interior. When he whispered to his confessor that he regretted dying from a clumsy hunting accident rather than on the battlefield, he was mourning not just his life but his legacy. He was being robbed of a noble death, subjected instead to an undignified, messy, and foul-smelling demise. He lay there, listening to the murmurs of the men slicing his veins, the solemn prayers of the priest preparing his soul, and the heavy silence of his grandfather, the king. He was surrounded by the absolute pinnacle of human power and wealth, yet he died utterly alone, isolated within the inescapable prison of his own collapsing anatomy. The specific pharmacological weapons unleashed upon the Duke's shattered abdomen triggered a catastrophic physiological reaction. The emetics administered by the royal apothecaries were not gentle stomach settlers. They were crude, violent concoctions, often derived from antimony or toxic plant extracts, designed to trigger the brain's chemoreceptor trigger zone with maximum ferocity. When these harsh chemicals hit Charles's already lacerated stomach lining, the reaction was explosive. The smooth muscle of the stomach wall convulsed with an unnatural bone-jarring force. The human stomach is designed to hold acid, but it is not designed to withstand violently induced repetitive spasms while punctured by fractured ribs. The mechanical sheer force of retching tore the initial puncture wound into a gaping hole. Simultaneously, the mana purge, a powerful osmotic laxative, drew massive amounts of water into his intestines, causing aggressive, cramping peristalsis. The combination of an exploding stomach and a convulsing lower intestinal tract obliterated whatever anatomical barriers remained. It was a perfect storm of iatrogenic destruction, disease caused by the healers themselves. The physicians essentially turned his digestive tract into a high-pressure pump, spraying highly infectious material, corrosive acid, and undigested matter directly into the sterile environment of his peritoneal cavity. The resulting agony was not merely a symptom, it was the direct mechanical result of a blind, dogmatic faith in an entirely flawed medical paradigm. The dawn of Wednesday, the 2nd of May, brought a new, far more lethal phase to the Duke of Berry's ordeal. The initial trauma of the hunting accident, the violent rupture of his liver and stomach, had already been compounded by the staggering fluid loss of the royal physician's bloodletting and the mechanical tearing caused by their harsh emetics. Now the battleground shifted from gross anatomy to the microscopic level. A profound systemic biological war was raging entirely unchecked within his abdomen. The peritoneum is a smooth, sterile membrane that lines the abdominal cavity, designed to keep the vital organs neatly packed and perfectly isolated from the outside world. When Charles's stomach was violently breached and then repeatedly spasmed by the medical purges, it was not merely hydrochloric acid that spilled into this pristine environment. The human digestive tract is host to billions of bacteria, microorganisms that are essential for digesting food within the tough protective walls of the intestines, but which become instantly, aggressively lethal the moment they escape into the sterile blood supply and abdominal cavity. The medical elite of 1714, standing around the Duke's bed in their heavy robes, possessed absolutely no concept as to a microscopic world. Guy Crescent Fagan and his colleagues had never heard of bacteria, sepsis, or infection. They viewed the human body as a closed hydraulic system of 4 fluids. Because they could not see the invisible armies of bacteria multiplying in the nutrient-rich, warm environment of the prince's pooled internal blood, they completely misinterpreted the catastrophic signs of his physical collapse. When Charles's fever spiked to temperatures that caused his muscular frame to seize with violent chills, the doctors did not recognize it as the immune system's desperate, failing attempt to boil alive the invading pathogens. Instead, they saw only an excess of heat and corrupted blood that needed to be aggressively cooled and drained. And so, on that Wednesday morning, driven by a terrifyingly confident ignorance, the royal surgeons approached the young man once again with their unwashed hands and their cold, unsterilized steel lancets. They deliberately reopened the wound on his foot, tearing through the fragile clots his failing body had desperately managed to form overnight. They wanted to see the blood flow freely, hoping to finally drain the black bile they believed was killing him. When the foot yielded only a sluggish dark trickle, because his blood pressure had bottomed out and his vascular system was collapsing, they did not stop. They simply moved to his arms, slicing into the veins there to force the body to give up its most precious resource. Every drop of blood that hit the brass basin was a nail in his coffin. The blood was indeed dark and thick, not because it was corrupted by humors, but because it was profoundly deoxygenated and concentrating rapidly due to severe dehydration. By stripping away his red blood cells, they were systematically suffocating his organs, starving his brain, liver, and kidneys of the oxygen they needed to survive the bacterial onslaught. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the very instruments they used to see him were likely introducing entirely new strains of staphylococcus directly into his open veins. Inside the Duke's abdomen, severe peritonitis caused his bowel to paralyze, a condition known as paralytic ileus. The immense internal pressure, exacerbated by the purgatives, reversed his natural peristalsis, resulting in stercoraceous vomiting. The prince was reduced to expelling a dark mixture of blood and intestinal matter, an indignity that shocked the witnessing courtiers. The psychological isolation of Charles de Bourbon during these hours was as absolute as his physical destruction. Just beyond the heavy gilded doors of his bedchamber stood his wife, Marie-Louise Elisabeth d'Orléans, the Duchess of Berry. She was weeping, frantic, and begging the guards to let her see her dying husband. Yet, the unyielding machinery of court protocol, directed by the cold rationality of Louis XIV, denied her entry. The king decreed that because the Duke, in his delirious agony, had not explicitly spoken her name and requested her presence, she was to be barred from the room. This was the ultimate expression of absolute monarchy, a system that controlled not only how a prince lived and reigned, but exactly how and with whom he was permitted to die. Charles was entirely alone in a room full of people. He was surrounded by physicians who were actively torturing him, courtiers who were watching him as a political spectacle, and a king whose stoic presence demanded an impossible standard of royal dignity in the face of excruciating bodily collapse. By Thursday, the 3rd of May, the lack of oxygenated blood and the overwhelming tide of bacterial toxins breached the blood-brain barrier. Sepsis-associated encephalopathy set in, fracturing the brilliant, youthful mind of the Duke. The severe delirium took hold, plunging him into a terrifying cognitive void where the lines between reality, nightmare, and excruciating physical pain dissolved entirely. He lost his grip on the passage of time and the identity of the men standing over him. Yet even as his mind crumbled, the rigid structures of his world refused to yield. His confessor, P. de la Rue, a man whose duty was to prepare the soul for the afterlife, stepped forward. Instead of offering soft comfort to a terrified, dying young man, the religious framing of the era demanded a harsh, stoic surrender. When Charles desperately whispered to Madame that he hoped he would not die, the priest immediately reprimanded him. He was sternly instructed to abandon all earthly hope, to stop clinging to his vibrant youth, and to focus solely on the judgment of God. He was forced to accept that his agonizing pain was a divine mandate, an inescapable spiritual test, even as the men standing right next to the priest systematically drained the last drops of his lifeblood. The relentless progression of Thursday night dragged the Duke of Berry into the final, inescapable stages of systemic physiological collapse. The severe peritonitis, now entirely unchecked and rampant throughout his abdominal cavity, had triggered a massive, overwhelming immune response that paradoxically accelerated his destruction. As the bacterial toxins saturated his bloodstream, they initiated a cascade of widespread inflammation. The delicate microscopic capillaries lining his lungs, which were designed to exchange oxygen with the air, began to sustain severe damage. They became highly permeable, leaking protein-rich fluid directly into the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where breathing actually occurs. This condition, recognized in modern medicine as acute respiratory distress syndrome, meant that Charles was essentially drowning from the inside out. As the evening wore on, his breathing grew terribly labored, transforming from shallow, rapid gasps into a wet, rattling struggle. The sheer mechanical effort required to pull air through the accumulating fluid exhausted whatever fragmented reserves of strength he had left. He could no longer tolerate lying flat on his back, as the fluid would pool and suffocate him entirely. Instead, he had to be propped up amidst the silk pillows, his chest heaving violently, his face a mask of absolute, suffocating terror. The chamber, entirely cut off from the fresh spring air of the Versailles gardens, became a heavy, suffocating tomb even before the prince had expired. The hundreds of beeswax candles cast long, flickering shadows across the faces of the silent courtiers, illuminating the sheer, unadulterated helplessness of human authority in the face of biological ruin. The royal physicians, having exhausted their arsenals of lancets, purges, and emetics, finally stepped back from the bed. Their withdrawal was not an admission of error, but a grim, silent acknowledgement that the corrupted humors had won. They stood with their hands folded, watching the young man choke on his own bodily fluids. The irony was devastating. These men were the architects of this accelerated agony, having torn his stomach wider with their violent drugs and drained his fighting strength with their blades. Yet they now stood as passive observers to the execution they had orchestrated. Charles's world had shrunk to the agonizing perimeter of his own failing respiratory system. The magnificent tapestries, the gold leaf on the ceiling, the hushed whispers of the most powerful aristocrats in Europe, none of it mattered. He was a human animal stripped of his titles, fighting a brutal, primitive battle for his next breath. At 10 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors of the bedchamber swung open, breaking the suffocating tension. King Louis XIV entered, not as a grandfather mourning a dying boy, but as the supreme embodiment of the French state fulfilling its sacred duty. He brought with him the viaticum, the final Eucharist given to a person on the threshold of death. The king's face was a study in absolute stoicism, a mask forged by decades of outliving his own children and grandchildren. The PR's procession of priests followed, carrying the holy oils for the sacrament of extreme unction. The ritual that followed was a profound, almost surreal juxtaposition of spiritual grace and visceral bodily decay. The priests approached the writhing, suffocating prince and began to anoint his sensory organs, his eyes, ears, nose, mouth, hands, and feet. They murmured ancient Latin prayers, asking for the forgiveness of sins committed by sight, hearing, and touch. Yet, as they anointed his lips, they had to carefully avoid the dark, crusted blood and putrid matter that still stained the corners of his mouth. As they anointed his feet, their fingers brushed against the violent, jagged incisions made by the royal surgeons only days before. The church was blessing a vessel that the medical establishment had systematically destroyed. Despite the profound delirium clouding his brain and the agonizing lack of oxygen suffocating his tissues, Charles experienced a final lucid surge of ingrained religious devotion. The arrival of the king and the host seemed to pierce through the fog of sepsis. He marshaled an almost impossible degree of physical control, forcing his trembling, exhausted body into a posture of reverence. He received the wafer, a profound effort considering his throat was raw and swollen from the continuous vomiting of corrosive stomach acid. This final act of submission was not merely religious. It was a surrender to his inevitable fate. He had spent 4 days fighting a war within his own flesh, a war exacerbated by every intervention meant to save him. By accepting the final rites, he was formally resigning from the physical world, untethering himself from the brutal, tearing agony of his shattered abdomen. When the king finally turned and left the room, the spiritual transaction was complete, leaving the Duke to face the purely mechanical failure of his failing organs. The early hours of Friday, the 4th of May, stretched out in a harrowing, agonizing vigil. To the king's departure, the atmosphere in the room shifted from solemn ritual to a raw, unvarnished death watch. The priests continued their quiet chanting, a monotonous drone that underscored the ragged, irregular rhythm of Charles's breathing. His circulation had now almost entirely failed. His extremities, drained of blood by the physicians and deprived of oxygen by his failing lungs, grew entirely cold and mottled with a dark purplish hue. The severe drop in his core blood pressure meant that his kidneys had ceased to function hours ago, allowing metabolic waste to flood his system, further poisoning his brain. He lay with his eyes half open, staring unseeingly at the heavy velvet canopy above him, his chest rising and falling with agonizing slowness. In his right hand, a priest had placed a heavy silver crucifix. The prince's fingers, pale and skeletal, curled around the metal with a desperate, rigid grip, an instinctive clinging to a solid object as his internal world dissolved into chaos. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, the excruciating struggle simply ceased. The prince's battered heart, having beaten wildly for days to compensate for the massive blood loss and the severe bacterial infection, finally exhausted its muscular limits. It stuttered, beat once more with a hollow, useless thud, and then stopped entirely. Charles de Bourbon exhaled a final shallow breath that barely disturbed the heavy air of the room. He was 27 years old. The silence that immediately followed his passing was absolute and terrifying. It was the profound, heavy stillness of a machine that has violently broken down and finally come to a rest. The young man who only a week prior was riding through the royal forest with the vigor and arrogance of an untouchable heir was now an inanimate object, a corpse ruined by a clumsy fall and dismantled by the arrogant ignorance of his era's greatest medical minds. His death marked not just the end of a royal life, but the culmination of a torturous protocol that perfectly encapsulated the lethal intersection of absolute power, blind dogmatism, and the fragile, unforgiving reality of the human body. The moment the prince's heart finally surrendered, the stifling atmosphere within the bedchamber underwent a violent, irreversible shift. It was no longer a theater of desperate, agonizing struggle. It instantly became a monument to a catastrophic failure. The transition from a living, suffering human being to an inanimate royal corpse was brutally swift. As the last breath left Charles de Bourbon's lungs, The immense tension that had gripped the room for 4 days simply evaporated, replaced by a heavy, terrifying silence. King Louis XIV, possessing a hardened stoicism forged by a lifetime of burying his own heirs, did not break down. He cast one final inscrutable look at the ruined body of his grandson, turned on his heel, and exited the chamber. His departure signaled the immediate shift in protocol. Charles was no longer a patient to be tortured under the guise of healing. He was now a political artifact, a piece of state property that needed to be processed, examined, and prepared for the morbid theater of a royal funeral. The physical transformation of the Duke in those first few hours of death was a grim testament to the absolute devastation wrought upon his system. Because his body had been entirely drained of its blood volume by the relentless use of the lancets, he did not exhibit the normal pooling of blood or livor mortis, common in the recently deceased. Instead, his skin took on a terrifying translucent quality, a waxen pallor that starkly highlighted the brutal, jagged incisions on his feet and arms. Rigor mortis began to set in rapidly, locking his limbs into the rigid posture of his final agony. The royal valets, men who had previously dressed the robust prince in the finest silks and velvets for grand balls and hunting expeditions, now approached the bed with trembling hands to strip away the sweat-soaked, blood-stained linens. They were forced to handle the body with extreme care, not out of reverence, but because the internal necrosis had progressed so rapidly that the very structural integrity of his flesh was severely compromised. Within hours, the heavy mahogany doors opened once again, not for priests bearing the sacrament, but for the royal surgeons bearing their heavy leather cases of instruments. In the paranoid, politically charged atmosphere of the 18th century French court, the sudden death of a healthy heir apparent immediately sparked rampant, terrified whispers of poison. To quell these rumors, and to satisfy the rigid bureaucratic demands of the crown, an immediate autopsy was mandated. Guy Crescent Fagan and his team of physicians returned to the bedside. There is a profound, sickening irony in the fact that the very men who had systematically dismantled the prince's internal organs with their purges and emetics were now tasked with opening him up to discover the cause of death. They arranged their bone saws, scalpels, and heavy silver retractors on a table beside the bed, standing over the corpse with the same arrogant, misplaced confidence they had displayed while he was alive. When the lead surgeon made the primary incision, drawing the heavy steel blade down the center of the Duke's abdomen, the physical reality of the medical torture was violently exposed. The moment the pressurized abdominal cavity was breached, the stench that filled the room was so overwhelmingly foul, so fundamentally unnatural, that several seasoned courtiers and assistants had to physically turn away, gagging into their scented handkerchiefs. It was not merely the smell of death, it was the sharp, acidic reek of chemical peritonitis, mixed with the heavy, rotting odor of advanced gangrene and raw fecal matter. The pristine, sterile environment of the peritoneum had been transformed into a toxic, blackened swamp. As the surgeons, Pew, led back the layers of muscle and fat, they did not find the neat anatomical structures depicted in their medical texts. They found a landscape of absolute chaotic ruin. The stomach, the epicenter of the initial trauma, was the most horrifying sight of all. The surgeons documented with a chilling clinical detachment that the organ was almost entirely destroyed. It had not simply ruptured, it had been reduced to a mashed, necrotic pulp. To the naked eye, it looked as though it had been dissolved from the inside out, hanging in jagged, blackened shreds. The liver, sitting just above it, bore the unmistakable violent tear from the impact with the saddle pommel, its tissues deeply inflamed and leaking putrid fluids. The intestines were violently swollen, discolored with the dark purple bruising of severe ischemia and paralysis. The entire cavity was flooded with a thick, corrupted mixture of coagulated blood, highly corrosive gastric acid, and the dark, foul-smelling remnants of the brutal manna purges they had forced down his throat. It was a textbook, catastrophic presentation of blunt force trauma, exacerbated by catastrophic iatrogenic mechanical stress. Yet as Fagon and the medical elite peered into this ruined cavity, their rigid adherence to Galenic dogma completely blinded them to their own complicity. They did not look at the shredded stomach and realize that their violent emetics had caused the tissue to tear itself apart. They did not look at the massive pool of internal blood and realize that their bloodletting had stripped the body of its ability to heal and fight the shock. Instead, they looked at the blackened, dissolved organs and saw exactly what they expected to see: the ultimate terrifying manifestation of corrupted black bile. They nodded to one another, entirely validated in their ignorance. In their minds, the sheer horrifying extent of the internal putrefaction was absolute proof that the bad humors had been extraordinarily powerful, entirely justifying their aggressive, violent attempts to purge the prince's body. They recorded the official cause of death as a violent internal corruption, carefully noting the ruptured tissue, but entirely failing to connect the mechanical destruction to the physical actions of their own hands. Following the autopsy, the grotesque process of preparing the royal corpse for state burial began. The surgeons, having satisfied their intellectual curiosity, proceeded to remove the ruined vital organs. The heart, the bowels, and the brain were traditionally excised, placed in separate lead-lined urns, and preserved for distinct religious ceremonies. This process of evisceration was meant to be a solemn, respectful separation of the royal flesh, but given the state of Charles's body, it resembled a desperate salvage operation. The empty abdominal cavity, now scrubbed of its toxic, necrotic slurry, was tightly packed with heavy aromatic herbs, salt, and strong spices, not for any spiritual reason, but out of the sheer, desperate necessity to halt the rapid putrefaction and mask the lingering odor of their medical failure. The body was then meticulously stitched closed, the jagged, brutalized flesh pulled tight with heavy thread. Once the crude embalming was complete, the valets returned to dress the hollowed-out shell of the Duke. They clothed him in his most magnificent robes of state, wrapping his pale waxen limbs in heavy gold brocade and fine lace. They placed his orders of chivalry across his chest and positioned his lifeless hands perfectly across his abdomen, hiding the brutal autopsy sutures beneath layers of immaculate fabric. He was moved from the blood-stained bed of his torture to a grand state bier, surrounded by tall, burning tapers and weeping attendants. To the outside world, to the thousands of subjects who would soon file past to pay their respects, he looked like a sleeping prince, a beautiful, tragic victim of a sudden hunting accident. The brutal tearing agony, the vomiting of black blood, the desperate suffocation, and the sheer mechanistic violence of the physician's treatments were entirely hidden beneath the glittering facade of royal pageantry. The physical reality of his destruction was sealed away in lead urns and buried beneath the dogma of a medical establishment that would not face its own lethal ignorance for another century. The royal undertakers sealed the Duke's hastily preserved corpse inside a massive lid coffin to contain the rapid decay. Following a grand state funeral at the Royal Basilica of Saint-Denis, he was interred in the Bourbon crypt. For nearly 80 years, his sealed coffin remained a time capsule of an archaic medical failure. However, in the autumn of 1793, the French Revolution violently breached the sacred walls. The revolutionaries, seeking valuable metal, pried open the lead casket, discarded the prince's remains into an unmarked mass grave, and destroyed them with quicklime. The absolute physical erasure of Charles de Bourbon was complete. The downfall of Charles de Bourbon was not merely a localized medical tragedy. It was a devastating, systemic blow to the power structure of all of Europe. That horrific riding accident completely altered the course of French history. In just 3 short years before this catastrophe, King Louis XIV had consecutively witnessed the deaths of his eldest son, his eldest grandson, and his great-grandson to disease. Charles had been the absolute last solid hope, a robust young man capable of shouldering the immense weight of the throne. When he stopped breathing in that suffocating chamber, the mighty Bourbon dynasty suddenly fractured into an extremely fragile state. The only remaining legitimate heir to the Sun King was a sickly 4-year-old child, the future King Louis XV. The terrifying prospect of extinction forced Louis XIV, in his final agonizing months, to write a desperate will. He shattered rigid royal protocols by legitimizing his bastard children in a frantic attempt to save the bloodline, an act that directly triggered a profound political crisis and a highly unstable regency period immediately following his own death. The devastating consequences of this medical execution also crashed directly down upon his wife, Marie-Louise Elizabeth, the Duchess of Berry, who had stood weeping and barred outside his chamber doors. She was pregnant when her husband died in agony. The massive psychological trauma and the crushing pressure of the royal court caused her to go into premature labor less than 2 months later. The infant died shortly after birth, permanently severing Charles's direct lineage. Left entirely without her husband's protection, the Duchess threw herself into a fiercely rebellious lifestyle, actively casting off the strict, suffocating rules of the Versailles court. She became the volatile epicenter of shocking scandals during the Regency. The dark shadow of the royal physician seemed to follow this family, for just 5 years later, in 1719, Louise herself died at the age of 23 in equally horrifying circumstances. Following a secret childbirth, she suffered a severe internal hemorrhage. The royal medical team, entirely blind to their past failures, once again applied their fatal protocol. They deliberately cut the veins in her feet to drain her blood, stripping away her final biological reserves and driving her to an early, agonizing death, exactly like the one they had inflicted upon her husband. As for Guy Crescent-Fagan and his elite medical team, they were never held legally or professionally accountable for their deadly interventions. The absolute authority of Galenic medicine remained strictly protected by the power of the crown. Fagan died a year later in 1715, carrying to his grave the steadfast, arrogant belief that he had done everything perfectly according to the highest medical standards. However, this series of high-profile royal deaths, coupled with autopsy reports that documented glaring, undeniable physical trauma that completely contradicted their humoral theories, sowed the critical first seeds of doubt across the continent. The European academic community began to quietly, then vocally, question the extreme destructive methods of systemic bloodletting and violent purging. The necrotic, ruined organs of Charles de Bourbon served as a definitive, undeniable case study. His agonizing death eventually forced the next generation of 18th century physicians to abandon the lethal dogma of ancient texts, slowly paving the way for evidence-based medicine and modern surgery, where the blade would finally be used to heal rather than to execute in the name of an archaic ideology.